The phone rang late at night, its shrill tone slicing through the silence of her dimly lit apartment. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for it, her mind racing. The message she had received earlier that day still echoed in her mind. A millionaire, a complete stranger, had made an offer, a proposition that seemed too insane to be real. She had stared at the text for nearly an hour before replying, her thoughts swarming like bees, each one more frantic than the last. She had been desperate. She was drowning in debt, barely scraping by with her job as a waitress at a small, run-down diner in the city. Her rent was overdue. Bills piled up. Her mother's medical expenses were a constant weight on her shoulders. She couldn't keep up with it all. The debt collectors were relentless, calling her day and night. Her life, once full of promise, now felt like a prison. But the offer. The offer was something she couldn't ignore. She had never met Richard L. before. They hadn't even spoken until that morning. But in the middle of her restless night, his message had come through, out of nowhere. The kind of offer that, once read, can never be unread. A millionaire with an insane proposition, one that could fix everything. "Let me make you an offer you can't refuse," he had written. "I'm willing to pay you a large sum of money for something no one else can offer. No strings attached. No obligations. Just a deal. Think about it." At first, she had laughed at the absurdity of it. A scam, she had thought. But curiosity, that nagging feeling she couldn't shake, made her reply. "How much are we talking about?" The response had come almost immediately. "Enough to clear your debts. Enough to change everything. Let's discuss the details tomorrow. If you're interested." Sarah hadn't known what she was expecting. Maybe a fake job offer. Maybe some outlandish scheme. But she hadn't expected this. "I need someone who is willing to part with something precious," Richard's message had continued. "In exchange, I will provide the financial freedom you crave. You're a woman in need. I can help." Her stomach had dropped at that moment. She had no idea what he meant, but she didn't want to find out. She didn't want to let herself fall deeper into the trap of desperation. But she had. That night, as she lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about what Richard had said. It wasn't just the money. It was the way he had offered it, so calm, so certain. He wasn't a man desperate to help. He was a man offering something he knew she would accept. Something that wasn't just about money. No, it was about power. It was about control. And he knew it. Her fingers had hovered over her phone screen again, torn between running far away from this and following through. She could ignore it. She could block his number and never look back. But then, that voice, the one that told her how much easier it would be to just go along with it, whispered in the back of her mind. What did she have to lose? The next morning, before the sun had risen, Sarah found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her dark brown hair was tangled, her eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. Her face looked older than 25. She had always been a fighter, always scraped by, but now, she wasn't sure she had the strength left to keep going. The weight of her mother's illness was crushing her. Her mother was all she had left. And as the bills kept piling up, it felt like she was standing on the edge of an abyss. One more step, and everything would fall apart. The phone buzzed again. "Richard." The message was brief, "Meet me today at the address I'll send. No one will know. It will be our secret. Bring nothing but yourself." Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the text, her mind spinning. What had she just agreed to? Was this even real? Still, something about it felt different. She wasn't sure why, but there was something in Richard's words that made her feel like she had no choice. She pulled herself together, grabbing her purse and slipping into a black dress she had kept in the back of her closet, one she rarely wore. It was simple, nothing fancy, but it made her feel like she could at least pretend to have control. The thought of meeting Richard made her sick to her stomach, but the need for money made her hands steady. When she arrived at the address, a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city, she felt like an imposter. The place looked too expensive, too polished. It didn't belong to her. She had never seen anything like it. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by a man in a dark suit, who didn't say a word but led her to an elevator. The elevator ride was silent. The man didn't look at her, didn't speak. He simply pressed a button and waited as the elevator ascended to the top floor. Sarah felt a strange knot twist in her stomach. This was it. She was already in too deep. No turning back now. The doors opened, and there was Richard. Tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, he exuded an air of wealth and authority. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his posture impeccable. But it was his smile that caught her off guard, warm, almost welcoming. It didn't fit with the feeling of coldness that had surrounded her since she had entered the building. "Welcome," Richard said smoothly, extending a hand. His voice was low, rich, and comforting. It made her feel like she was already under his control. "I'm glad you came." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had rehearsed 100 different lines in her head on the way here, but now they all seemed meaningless. She reached out and shook his hand, her grip stiff, unsure. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard continued, his eyes scanning her with a kind of curiosity. "I know this might seem unusual, but I assure you, you're in good hands." Sarah couldn't find her voice. All she could do was nod. "Follow me," he said, turning and leading her down a long corridor. The floor was polished marble, and the walls were lined with expensive art. Every inch of the building screamed luxury. It made her feel small, out of place, like a fish in a tank too big for her. They reached a large room, its windows overlooking the city skyline. The space was lit with soft, ambient light, and the furniture was minimalist but rich in design. A plush chair sat by a small table, and a glass of water rested on the surface. Richard motioned for her to sit. "Please, take a seat," he said, his tone calm, almost soothing. She sat, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Richard finally broke it. "I want to make this clear, Sarah. There's no pressure. You can walk away at any time. But if you decide to accept my offer, your life will change." She glanced at him, the knot in her stomach tightening again. "What exactly do you want from me?" Richard's eyes softened as he leaned forward. "What I want is simple. I want you to give me something that no amount of money can buy, your virginity." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her stomach twisting into knots. "You don't have to decide now," he continued, as if reading her thoughts. "Think it over. I'm not in a rush." But it was too late. Sarah already knew. Deep down, she knew what she was about to do. The money. The freedom. The escape from everything that had been suffocating her. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A slow smile spread across Richard's face. "Good. You made the right choice." Sarah couldn't explain why she said those words. But as she sat there, in that sterile, luxurious room, she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in months. Maybe this was her way out. Maybe she could survive after all. But as she left the building later that day, something gnawed at her. Was this really what she wanted? What had she gotten herself into? Little did she know, that question would haunt her for the days to come. The deal was just the beginning. What came next would shatter everything she thought she knew. The next morning, Sarah barely slept. Her mind raced with doubt, with fear, and with hope. She stared at the ceiling, the soft hum of her alarm clock the only sound in the silence of her small apartment. The previous day's events felt like a dream, like something she hadn't truly experienced. But the truth of what she had agreed to settled in her chest like a heavy stone. The promise of money. The promise of freedom. She had agreed to sell something so personal, something so intimate, to a man she didn't even know. She glanced at her phone, expecting another message from Richard. But the screen was empty. Had he changed his mind? Had he reconsidered the offer? Sarah shook her head, trying to push those thoughts away. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. The weight of the promise pressed down on her as she threw on a simple dress and grabbed her purse. It was a beautiful day outside, the sun shining brightly through the window, but Sarah couldn't enjoy it. Everything felt distant, unreal. She went through the motions, making her way to the bus stop, getting off at the right stop, and walking through the streets like a woman on a mission. Yet, all she could focus on was what would happen later, what she had agreed to do. She had convinced herself that it was just a transaction. She would show up, go through with it, and leave. It would be over. Her debts would be cleared. Her mother's medical bills would no longer haunt her. Everything would change. But deep inside, a quiet voice kept whispering to her, warning her that she was stepping into something much bigger than she could understand. As she approached the building where she had met Richard, Sarah's heart beat faster. The sleek glass doors gleamed in the sunlight, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been there just yesterday, but today it felt different, like she was walking into something unknown. The same man in the dark suit greeted her at the entrance. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge her in any way other than to nod and gesture toward the elevator. Her steps were shaky as she followed him inside, the cool metal doors closing behind them with a soft chime. The elevator seemed to ascend slower this time, as if it were preparing her for what lay ahead. She couldn't escape now. This was it. When the doors opened, Richard was waiting for her in the same room as yesterday. But today, something was different. There was a strange tension in the air, as if something unspoken hung between them. The room was dimmer, the soft lighting casting long shadows against the walls. "Good to see you again, Sarah," Richard said, his voice calm but with a subtle undertone of something more, something predatory. "I trust you've thought it through." Sarah nodded, her throat dry. "I've thought about it." "Good. This isn't a decision to be taken lightly," he said, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "But you're here, and you've made your choice." She swallowed hard, looking around the room. It was far more extravagant than she had anticipated, rich mahogany furniture, thick carpets, and expensive art hanging on the walls. It was a world so far removed from her own that she couldn't quite grasp its reality. She felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. "I'm ready," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Richard smiled. "You don't need to worry. You're not the first woman to make this decision, and you certainly won't be the last." He gestured toward a leather chair in the corner of the room. "Please, sit. I have a few things to explain." Sarah took a seat, feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart was racing. What was he going to say? What had she really agreed to? Richard walked around the room, taking his time as if savoring the moment. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You're giving me something invaluable, something no one else can give me. And in return, you'll walk away with a sum of money that will change your life." Sarah nodded again, her mind struggling to keep up with the conversation. She could feel the tension in her chest tightening, but there was no turning back now. She had already come this far. Richard stopped in front of her, his eyes locking onto hers. "But there's something you should know. This isn't just about money. It's about power. Control. You're here because you've allowed yourself to be. And now, you'll experience a side of life that you've only ever dreamed of. But understand this, you are no longer in control. I am. The word struck Sarah like a slap in the face. She had known, deep down, that this wasn't just about money. There was something dark, something manipulative about the way Richard spoke, but hearing him say it out loud made her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, her unease growing with every passing second. Richard smiled, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "I mean that you have entered my world now. And once you've stepped in, there's no going back. You'll follow my rules, and I'll make sure you get exactly what you need." The room suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in around her. She felt trapped. She had made a deal, but what kind of deal was this really? Was it too late to back out? "Don't look so concerned," Richard said, as if sensing her discomfort. "I've taken care of everything. You'll never have to worry about anything again." His words were designed to reassure, but they only made her feel more uncertain. He stepped closer, and for the first time, Sarah could sense the power he held over her. It was in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her as if she were nothing more than a possession to be controlled. She had made a choice that had come with a price. She just hadn't realized how high that price would be. "Why don't we make this official?" Richard said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more commanding. "The money will be wired to your account in an hour. You'll see a figure that will wipe away your debts and give you more than enough to start over. But before I do that, I need to see if you're truly ready." Sarah stood up, her legs shaky as she faced him. "What do you mean?" "I need to see if you can truly trust me," he replied, stepping closer. "Trust is the foundation of any agreement, Sarah. If you don't trust me, then all of this is meaningless." I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Richard didn't seem surprised. Instead, he looked at her with what seemed like pity, as though he understood exactly how she felt. "You're afraid. That's normal. But fear is something we can overcome, together." The room felt suffocating now, the tension thick in the air. Sarah's mind raced. What had she agreed to? What kind of man was Richard? "I don't want to do this anymore," she said suddenly, her voice shaking. Richard didn't react with anger or frustration. He simply smiled. "It's too late to turn back now. You knew what you were getting into when you agreed. You knew there was no going back." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She felt trapped, caught in something she didn't fully understand. She had made a deal, but was this really the deal she had signed up for? "I want the money," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Richard's smile widened, and he nodded. "Good. Then the deal is done." He turned away from her, typing something into his phone. Sarah's mind spun. What had she just done? The answer was clear. There was no going back now. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Richard made a few phone calls, and soon enough, Sarah received a notification on her phone. The money had been transferred. The sum was staggering, enough to pay off her debts, her mother's medical bills, and more. It was everything she had ever wanted. But as she stared at the screen, something deep within her gnawed at her, warning her that she had made a choice she would never be able to undo. Sarah's phone buzzed, dragging her from the unsettling thoughts that had been circling in her mind like vultures. Her thumb hesitated over the screen as she glanced at the bank notification. The number staring back at her seemed surreal. It was a life-changing amount of money, money she had never dreamed of seeing in her lifetime. She had done it. She had sold a piece of herself, and in return, her problems were solved. The weight of her mounting debts was lifted. Her mother's medical bills no longer loomed over her like a dark cloud, suffocating her every step. But as she stared at the balance, a wave of nausea washed over her. What had she really done? The room felt colder now. The plush leather chair she had sat in earlier seemed far less comforting than before. The walls, once warm and inviting, now felt like they were closing in on her. Richard had left her alone, promising her that she was free to go once everything had been settled. But the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep in was something she couldn't shake. She had been given everything she wanted, but in return, she had lost something. Her sense of control. Her sense of self. The elevator ride back down to the lobby seemed like an eternity. The buzzing in her ears drowned out the sound of the elevator music, and her hands trembled as she held onto the metal rail. With each floor that passed, the reality of her choice sank deeper into her bones. She had agreed to something so intimate, something that would forever change her. She could never undo it. As the elevator doors slid open, Sarah stepped out into the sleek lobby, the polished floors gleaming beneath her feet. The same man in the dark suit was waiting for her at the entrance, his eyes scanning her face with a detached curiosity. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone flat, almost bored. Sarah nodded, but she didn't feel all right. She felt like a stranger in her own skin. "You're free to go," he added, stepping aside to let her pass. "But remember what I said. There's no going back from this." His words were a reminder that she wasn't in control. She never had been. She was a player in someone else's game, a game that she didn't fully understand. But as she stepped out into the bright sunlight, she pushed those thoughts aside. She had money now. Money that would solve everything. The rest didn't matter. The streets felt different as she walked home. The sounds of the city seemed muffled, like she was moving through a dream. Her feet carried her automatically, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but she tried to silence those thoughts. When she arrived at her apartment, the first thing she did was sit down at her kitchen table, pulling the receipt from the bank transfer onto the table in front of her. She stared at the numbers again, trying to convince herself that everything was fine, that everything was going to be okay. She had what she needed. She had what she had been fighting for. But then her phone buzzed again. The message was from Richard. "I hope you're not regretting our deal," the message read. "Because this is only the beginning. I'll be in touch soon." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The message was brief, almost casual, but the words were laced with something darker, something threatening. It was a reminder that she had stepped into a world that she didn't understand, a world where she had no control. Sarah quickly shoved the phone into her bag and shook her head, trying to push away the creeping sense of unease. This was it. This was the answer to all her problems. She would pay off the debts. She would start fresh. She could move on with her life. But deep inside, something wasn't right. 2 days passed, and Sarah went about her usual routine. She made plans to pay off her bills, called her mother's doctors to schedule the next round of treatments, and even went out to buy new clothes, celebrating the first real freedom she had felt in years. But even as she walked down the streets, a small voice in her mind kept whispering that something was wrong. The weight of the money felt like a heavy chain around her neck. She had taken the money. She had agreed to the deal. But in return, what had she really given away? Her dignity? Her peace of mind? Richard's message lingered in the back of her mind, haunting her like a shadow that refused to go away. It was then that the first strange thing happened. She was at a local coffee shop when her phone buzzed again. It was a number she didn't recognize. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something in the pit of her stomach told her that this was something she couldn't ignore. "Hello?" she answered hesitantly. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, and strangely familiar. "Sarah, I trust you're enjoying your new life?" Sarah froze. It was Richard. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "Relax," Richard said with an easy laugh. "I just wanted to check in. See how you're adjusting." "I'm fine," Sarah replied quickly, a lie that felt hollow even as she said it. "What do you want?" I'm just making sure you don't forget your place, Richard said, his tone now taking on a darker edge. You may have your money, but remember, there's more to this than just the transaction. The deal isn't over. You're not free. Sarah's stomach twisted. The weight of his words felt like chains wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into something she couldn't escape. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Don't worry, Richard said, his voice dropping lower. You'll understand soon enough. Before she could respond, the call disconnected. Sarah stared at her phone, her heart racing. She had no idea what he meant. You'll understand soon enough. What did that even mean? She spent the rest of the day in a fog. The words swirled around her, making it harder and harder to focus on anything else. She had thought the money was her ticket out. She had thought it was the answer to everything, but now it felt more like a trap. As the days passed, Richard's messages became more frequent. Short, cryptic notes that hinted at something more, something she couldn't yet understand. Sometimes he called, sometimes he didn't. But the messages were always the same, a subtle reminder that the deal wasn't over. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. There was no escaping it. The deal she had made with Richard was no longer just about money, it was about something deeper. Something more dangerous. And no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. Richard held the strings, and she was the puppet. Sarah could no longer ignore the growing unease that haunted her every waking moment. The more she tried to focus on the positives, the money, the freedom from debt, the promise of a new start, the more the shadows of her past actions crept back in. Richard's words were like ghosts, haunting her, twisting in her mind until they felt real and suffocating. She tried to push through it. She paid off her debts, scheduled her mother's treatments, and even treated herself to a small vacation to clear her mind. But no matter where she went, no matter how far she tried to run, she felt the weight of Richard's presence hovering over her. The messages from him had become more frequent, more invasive. The tone had shifted from casual to almost personal, as though he were watching her every move. He seemed to know where she was, who she was with, and even what she was doing. His words were like a puzzle she couldn't solve, each cryptic message leaving her with more questions than answers. The latest message had arrived that morning, just as she was finishing her coffee. I hope you're not getting too comfortable, Sarah. This is just the beginning. Her hands trembled as she read the words. It was as if he had planted himself inside her thoughts, watching her every step. The room around her felt smaller, the air thicker, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Sarah glanced out of her apartment window, the busy city street below offering no comfort. The world seemed unchanged, but inside, she felt different, like she was being pulled into something much darker than she had ever anticipated. The following days were a blur. Sarah had managed to convince herself that she was simply overreacting, that the messages were nothing more than the paranoia of someone who had made a life-changing decision. She tried to live normally, to move forward with her life, but the nagging feeling in the back of her mind never went away. She felt like a puppet, dancing to someone else's tune. One night, after a long day of running errands, Sarah was walking back to her apartment when she noticed a figure standing across the street. She couldn't quite make out the face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Richard. Her heart skipped a beat. What was he doing here? How did he find her? It wasn't just the proximity that rattled her, it was the certainty in her gut that he had been following her. She quickly ducked into the nearby alley, trying to remain unseen, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she pressed herself against the cold brick wall. She waited, straining to hear any sign of movement. But the street remained eerily quiet. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly peeked around the corner. The figure was gone. Her pulse raced. She had to get out of there. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly afraid. Not just of Richard, but of the world she had inadvertently stepped into. What had started as a desperate decision had spiraled into something far more sinister. She returned to her apartment, locking the door behind her and double-checking all the windows. Her mind was in overdrive. She tried to convince herself that she was being paranoid, that Richard had no reason to be following her, that everything was fine. But the feeling that something was deeply wrong gnawed at her. Then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed again. It was Richard. "I know what you did today, Sarah." Her stomach dropped. The message was a chilling reminder that Richard had eyes everywhere. "You can't hide from me. Not anymore." The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. Sarah became hyper-aware of every movement, every person that crossed her path. She no longer felt safe in her own skin. The sense of control she once had, the sense of independence, had vanished. One afternoon, as she sat at a cafe, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, her phone buzzed again. "Meet me at the usual place." The message was simple, but the tone of it was enough to send a wave of panic through her chest. She knew exactly what the usual place was, the luxurious penthouse suite where everything had begun. Sarah didn't want to go. Every instinct in her told her to ignore the message, to disappear, to start over somewhere far away. But the truth was, she couldn't escape. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what Richard wanted from her, and why she was trapped in his world. She drove to the penthouse, the weight of dread hanging over her like a storm cloud. The familiar building loomed in front of her, its sleek glass walls reflecting the city lights as she parked her car. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but the closer she got to the entrance, the more her heart pounded. Inside, the elevator ride felt interminable. Each floor seemed to drag by, the familiar hum of the elevator mocking her sense of helplessness. When the doors finally opened, she stepped into the dimly lit lobby, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of Richard. He was waiting for her. "Come in," he said, his voice low and smooth as always. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but she had no choice. She had to confront him. Inside the suite, Richard was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked perfectly at ease, as if nothing had changed. But for Sarah, everything had changed. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this room weeks ago. The weight of her decisions, the pressure of the unknown, was starting to consume her. "Sit down," Richard instructed, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling calm. Sarah took a seat across from him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She refused to show fear, but the coldness in her chest told her that she couldn't hide what she was feeling. Richard studied her for a moment, his gaze calculating. "You look different," he said, his voice soft but piercing. "I can see it in your eyes. You're realizing, aren't you? There's no going back." Sarah swallowed hard. "What do you want from me, Richard?" The words came out more sharply than she intended, but she didn't care. She needed answers. Richard smiled, an almost predatory grin that sent a chill down her spine. "I want you to understand that you're mine now. You made a deal, Sarah. And no amount of money will erase the consequences." The air in the room seemed to thicken as he spoke. Sarah's mind raced. She had been a pawn in his game, but she wasn't ready to accept that. She couldn't let herself be a puppet forever. "What do you mean by consequences?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned forward, his smile widening. "You've already begun to see them. You think this is about money? It's not. It's about power, Sarah. The kind of power that can change lives. And right now, you're at the center of it all." The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. Sarah didn't know what kind of world she had stepped into, but she was starting to realize that she was in over her head. She had been blinded by her desperation, thinking that money would fix everything. But now she saw that there were things far darker than money. And Richard held the keys to it all. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to escape. But she knew, deep down, that she was already too far gone. The game had only just begun. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. The walls of the penthouse seemed to close in on her as Richard's words echoed in her mind, "You're mine now. You made a deal." Each sentence he had spoken, each unsettling glance, began to pierce through her like a needle, drawing out the last remnants of her peace. The money had been a momentary escape, but now it felt like a chain, heavy and unyielding, locking her to him in a way she couldn't understand. For the past few days, she had tried to keep her composure, to pretend that everything was fine. But the grip of Richard's presence was suffocating. She felt like a puppet on strings, her every move, every decision controlled by the man who had offered her everything in exchange for something she couldn't quite name. Every time she looked at her bank account, the number staring back at her seemed like a lie, a trap. Was it worth it? She knew she had to break free, but the question lingered, how? It had been nearly a week since that night in the penthouse. The messages from Richard had become more frequent and increasingly cryptic. He seemed to be testing her, pushing her into situations where she had no control, where the boundaries between right and wrong were blurred. She was no longer just someone who had made a desperate choice, she was now a part of something much bigger, something that terrified her more than any of her debts ever had. That morning, Sarah had received a message that made her heart skip a beat. "Come to my office. We have a lot to discuss." It was brief, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to turn off her phone and try to forget about Richard, about everything that had happened. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She arrived at Richard's office just after noon. The building was imposing, its steel and glass facade reflecting the city skyline in a cold, almost clinical way. The elevator ride to the top floor seemed endless. She couldn't help but feel like the walls were closing in again, just as they had when she entered the penthouse. Her palms were sweaty, her breath shallow, and yet, she couldn't seem to stop herself. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped out into a sleek, modern lobby. A receptionist gave her a polite nod and gestured for her to take a seat. It wasn't long before Richard's assistant appeared, motioning for her to follow. Richard's office was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't the kind of place where deals were struck in shadowy corners, it was bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. The view was stunning, but it was hard for Sarah to appreciate it. All she could focus on was Richard, who sat behind his desk, his posture relaxed, as though he had been waiting for her all along. "Sit down, Sarah," he said, his voice low and smooth, like he was speaking to a child. She sat, but only after a brief moment of hesitation. The last time they had spoken in person, she had felt like a stranger in her own skin. Now, that feeling had returned, stronger than ever. Richard didn't waste any time. "I know you've been thinking a lot about our arrangement," he began, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're wondering what comes next, aren't you?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the fear and confusion that churned inside her? How could she ask him what this was all really about when she didn't even understand it herself? "I can tell you're not happy," Richard continued, his voice steady. "I understand your hesitation. But you need to understand something. This isn't just about money. This is about control. Power. And what I offer you is far greater than just financial freedom." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. "You think this is a game. You think it's as simple as exchanging money for favors. But it's far more complicated than that. You've stepped into a world where everything is a transaction, where power is the ultimate currency. And right now, you're more valuable to me than you could ever imagine. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known that there was something about Richard, something about his world, that was dangerous, but she hadn't fully understood it until now. This wasn't just about a debt being paid off. This was about something far darker, far more complicated. "You're not the only one in this world," Richard continued, his voice almost sympathetic. "There are many like you, people who are desperate, people who are willing to do anything to survive. And I can give them what they want. But it comes with a price. Everything comes with a price." Sarah's mind was spinning. Was she just one of many? One of countless others who had been lured into his web with promises of wealth and freedom? "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Why me? Why did you choose me?" Richard's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the mask of calm slipped away, revealing something far colder beneath. "Because you were the perfect candidate," he said, his tone chilling. "You were vulnerable. You were desperate. And most importantly, you were willing to make a deal." The truth of his words struck her like a slap to the face. She had been desperate, yes. But had she really understood what she was getting herself into? Had she truly known the cost of the deal she had made? She wanted to stand up and leave. To run far away and forget all of this. But she couldn't. The money, the debts, her mother's health, she had no choice but to keep playing his game. "You don't have to do this, Sarah," Richard said, as though reading her mind. "But if you want out, you'll have to pay the price. And I'm not talking about money this time." The word sent a chill down her spine. What did he mean by that? What price was he referring to? Richard stood up, walking over to a cabinet along the wall. He opened it and pulled out a thick envelope, which he handed to her without saying a word. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking from the envelope to Richard. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "You'll find everything you need inside," Richard said, his voice now colder than ever. "Your next move depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice." Sarah left the office feeling more confused and scared than ever. The envelope was still clutched tightly in her hand, but she had no idea what to expect when she opened it. Her mind raced with a million questions, but one thing was certain: Richard wasn't done with her yet. As she walked back to her car, she opened the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was a set of documents, contracts, agreements, and something that made her stomach drop: a list of names. The names were familiar. Some of them were people she had met briefly in the past, colleagues, acquaintances, but others were complete strangers. "What is this?" she muttered under her breath, but deep down, she already knew. This wasn't just about her anymore. Richard had plans for her, plans that involved far more than money or power. She had become a part of something bigger. And whether she liked it or not, there was no turning back now. Sarah sat in her apartment, the envelope still unopened on the table in front of her. The air felt thicker, heavier than it ever had before, like she was trapped in a world that was no longer hers to control. Richard's cryptic words echoed in her mind, his promise of power and control over her life still fresh in her ears. "You've stepped into a world where everything is a transaction," he had said. "And right now, you're more valuable to me than you could ever imagine." The names in that envelope weighed on her, each one more ominous than the last. They were the names of people who, like her, had been pulled into Richard's world of deals, power, and influence. Some were high-profile, their faces known across media platforms, while others were complete strangers, their only connection to Richard a shared desperation, a willingness to sacrifice something, perhaps even everything, for a promise of wealth, freedom, or power. Sarah had always thought of herself as independent, someone who could solve her problems on her own. But she was learning the hard way that power wasn't something you earned, it was something you gave away, piece by piece, until it was gone completely. She couldn't avoid the envelope any longer. Richard had been very clear about one thing: her next move depended on how much she was willing to sacrifice. She had already sacrificed her dignity, her sense of security, and perhaps even her moral compass. But was she willing to go further? What was left for her to give? Taking a deep breath, Sarah finally reached for the envelope. She unfolded the papers inside, each one like a new layer of the web that had ensnared her. The contracts were written in precise legal jargon, but it was the list of names that struck her the hardest. They weren't just names, they were people she could reach out to, people who were caught up in the same game as she was. Some were well-known public figures, their lives on display for everyone to see. Others, she had no memory of meeting. But the connection was clear. Richard had orchestrated something vast, something that involved more than just money or favors. It was about control. And it was about leverage. At the bottom of the list was a final note, written in Richard's familiar script. "The game has begun, Sarah. You're already in it. You can either play or walk away, but if you walk away, you'll lose everything. And I mean everything." Sarah's hand trembled as she put the papers down. She had thought that by accepting Richard's offer, she could escape her debts, rebuild her life. But now, she realized that she wasn't rebuilding anything, she was being manipulated, used as a pawn in a much larger scheme. The money had been a brief escape, a momentary high, but the price of that escape was becoming clearer with each passing day. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had gotten herself into. She thought about her mother, her health, her dreams of a life free from the weight of her past mistakes. But those dreams seemed so far away now, slipping through her fingers like sand. Richard had made sure of that. She kept coming back to the same question: what had she agreed to? And why? The more she tried to push the thoughts aside, the more they consumed her. She thought about the power Richard wielded, the way he controlled everything around him with a cold, calculating ease. There was no warmth in his world, no compassion, just a brutal game of manipulation and control. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that the money had solved all her problems. She had a new problem now: how to break free from Richard before she lost herself completely. The next morning, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't do it alone anymore. She needed help. But who could she turn to? Who could she trust? Her mind wandered to the names in the envelope. Some of those people might be able to help her, if they weren't already too far gone. But how could she reach out to them? How could she even begin to make contact without drawing Richard's attention? Then, it hit her. There was one person, one name she recognized from the list who might understand what she was going through. Ella Donovan. Ella was a former business associate of Richard's, someone who had once worked closely with him before suddenly disappearing from the public eye. Sarah remembered reading about her in the news years ago. Ella had been an up-and-coming star in the business world, a woman who had it all, until she didn't. It was rumored that she had been caught in a scandal involving Richard, though the details were always vague. Since then, she had faded from the public eye. Sarah had no idea if Ella would be willing to help her, but she had to try. That afternoon, Sarah found herself standing outside a modest coffee shop in the city's outskirts. The place was a far cry from the luxurious venues she had grown accustomed to in Richard's world. It felt more like a refuge, a place where she could breathe again, away from the suffocating grip of power and manipulation. Inside, Ella sat at a corner table, her dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, dressed casually in a pair of jeans and a loose sweater. She looked nothing like the polished businesswoman Sarah had seen in the media. As Sarah approached, Ella looked up and smiled, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. "Sarah, right?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Sarah nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Ella, I didn't know who else to turn to." Ella raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Sarah hesitated before continuing. "I need help. I don't know what I've gotten myself into, but it's worse than I ever imagined. Richard, he's not just about money. It's power, control, and I don't know how to get out. Ella's eyes narrowed, her expression turning serious. You've made a deal with him, haven't you? Sarah nodded, her throat tight. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. I thought it was just about paying off my debts. But now I'm not sure what's real anymore. I don't even know who I am in this game. Ella sat back in her chair, studying Sarah carefully. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ella spoke. You're in deeper than you think. Richard doesn't play fair. And he doesn't let people go easily. But there is a way out. It won't be easy, and it won't come without cost, but you can escape him. Sarah leaned forward, desperate. How? Ella's eyes softened, but only slightly. You need to start by cutting the ties. You have to make him believe that you're no longer useful to him. That you're no longer a threat. But you also have to be ready for the consequences of that. Richard doesn't let go of people without a reason. Sarah swallowed hard. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Ella looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded. All right. But know this, you may win in the end, but you'll lose a part of yourself in the process. That's the price of dealing with someone like Richard. Sarah didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do now. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. That night, Sarah composed a message to Richard. I'm done. I'm no longer interested in playing your game. Consider this our final transaction. I'm cutting ties. It was a bold move. But the words felt liberating, like she was taking back some small part of herself that had been lost. She sent the message, took a deep breath, and waited. It was only a matter of time before Richard responded. But when he did, it wasn't what Sarah expected. You don't get to walk away that easily. And just like that, she knew the real game had only just begun. Sarah stood in her small apartment, the faint hum of the city outside the window doing little to calm her racing thoughts. The message she had sent to Richard had left her with a strange, uneasy feeling. She had thought she would feel relief, the kind that comes when you finally take control of your own life again, but it was gone before it even had a chance to settle in. The truth was, the moment she sent those words, I'm done. I'm no longer interested in playing your game. Consider this our final transaction. I'm cutting ties. She had known it wouldn't be that simple. Richard didn't let go of people like her. He wouldn't just accept that she was walking away. She could feel it in her bones, the way his game had been designed to trap her, to keep her on the hook no matter what. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. Control. And she had threatened it by sending that message. Her phone buzzed again, and she froze. Richard had responded almost immediately, but the message was chilling in its simplicity. You don't get to walk away that easily. It was almost too short, too direct, yet it carried a weight that sent a shiver down her spine, ***. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to keep pretending that everything would go back to normal if she just kept her head down and moved on with her life. But deep down, she knew that ignoring him would only make things worse. Richard was the kind of man who didn't forget. He didn't let people off the hook. Not unless they were useful to him. But what had she been to him? A pawn? A tool? Or something else entirely? What was he truly after? The days passed slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. The tension in Sarah's life was unbearable. It was as though Richard's presence loomed over her, even without him being physically there. His influence, the weight of his world, hung like a cloud, suffocating her. She had tried to move on, tried to focus on her life outside of the mess she had gotten herself into, but there was no escaping it. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart would race, her hands would tremble. Would it be Richard? Would it be another ominous message? Or worse, would it be a phone call that would change everything? But the silence was the worst part. 4 hours, nothing. No messages, no calls. And that made her feel even more helpless. What was Richard planning? What kind of game was he playing now? One evening, as Sarah walked home from the corner store, the night air cold against her skin, she heard footsteps behind her. It was late, and the street was nearly empty. For a moment, her heart skipped in panic. Was it Richard? Had he found her? The footsteps grew closer, and she quickened her pace, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She didn't dare look back. Then, just as she turned the corner toward her building, she heard a voice. Sarah. It was quiet, almost casual, but the tone made her stop dead in her tracks. She spun around. Standing in the dim light of the street lamp was a figure she recognized instantly. It was Ella Donovan. Her first reaction was a wave of relief, followed by confusion. What was Ella doing here? What did she want? Ella? What are you? How did you find me? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ella gave her a small, knowing smile. I told you I'd help you. But it's time to take things to the next level. Richard isn't just going to let you go. You should have known that from the start. Sarah's chest tightened. I thought I could just walk away. I thought I could end it. You can't, Ella said bluntly. That's not how Richard works. If you think you can cut ties with him without consequences, you're wrong. And those consequences are coming for you. They're already on their way. Sarah's heart sank. What do I do? Ella stepped closer, lowering her voice. You need to be prepared for what's coming. Richard is a lot more powerful than you realize. His reach extends far beyond just you. And if he's willing to play games with someone like you, that means you're on his radar for good. But there's a way out. A way to win. But it'll cost you. Sarah stared at her. What kind of cost? Ella didn't immediately answer. She studied Sarah's face, as though trying to gauge how far Sarah was willing to go. The price you'll pay isn't something you can put a number on. It's not money. It's your sense of security. Your peace of mind. If you want to walk away from Richard, you need to fight back. But not in the way you think. Sarah didn't understand. Fight back? How? Ella's lips pressed into a thin line. You think you can just cut ties with him, walk away, and everything will be fine? That's naive. He won't just forget about you. He's going to make sure you regret it. But there's a way to take control of the situation. There's a way to turn the tables on him. The words were hanging in the air, heavy with meaning. Sarah felt like she was grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something solid, but everything seemed so blurry now. What do I need to do? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ella took a deep breath. You need to give him something he wants. Something he values more than money, more than power. You need to make him believe you're not a threat. You need to make him think that you're no longer a part of his game. Only then will you have a chance of escaping. Sarah didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to play the game anymore. She wanted it to be over. But deep down, she knew there was no simple solution. If she wanted out, she would have to fight for it. And the fight was about to begin. The next few days were a blur of tension. Richard's messages became more sporadic, his presence more distant. Sarah wasn't sure whether that was a good sign or a bad one. But she couldn't afford to wait and see. Ella's words kept echoing in her mind, give him something he wants. But what could she possibly offer Richard that he didn't already have? It wasn't until she received a call from an unexpected source that the answer hit her. The voice on the other end of the line was sharp, authoritative, and completely unfamiliar. Sarah, the voice said. This is Marcus. I'm calling on behalf of Richard. We need to talk. The chill in his tone made Sarah's stomach turn. "What is this about?" she asked, her heart pounding. "You know exactly what it's about," Marcus replied. "Richard has given you a chance. He's not going to kill you or ruin your life, yet. But you're going to need to make a decision. And the sooner you make it, the better." "What decision?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "The decision to play by the rules," Marcus said. "Richard wants to know what you're willing to sacrifice. If you don't respond soon, you'll find yourself on the losing end of this deal." The line went silent for a moment, and then Marcus added, "Time's running out, Sarah." Sarah's heart raced as she hung up the phone. What was Richard planning now? What did he mean by sacrifice? And what would be the cost of crossing him again? The final confrontation was inevitable. Sarah knew that now. She couldn't walk away without a price, but what would that price be? With a sense of dread in her gut, she made a decision. She would face Richard. She would meet him on his terms, ready to play the game to its bitter end. The meeting took place at Richard's penthouse, a place Sarah had come to dread but knew was inevitable. The moment she walked in, the cold, familiar feeling of being trapped settled over her like a shroud. Richard sat behind his desk, his gaze cold, unreadable. He looked at her without speaking for a long time, as though weighing her very existence. "I didn't think you'd show up," he finally said, his voice smooth but edged with something darker. "You've made your decision, I see." "I'm here," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the shaking in her legs. "What do you want from me?" Richard leaned back in his chair, a small smile curving his lips. "I want to know if you're ready to accept the cost of your freedom, Sarah. You've made a bold move by trying to walk away. But everything has a price. And now, you have to pay it." Sarah looked him in the eye, her heart pounding. "I'm ready." "What is it?" Richard stood and walked toward her, his presence towering over her like a shadow. He placed something on the table in front of her, a document, a contract. "This is the price," he said. "Sign it, and your freedom is guaranteed. Walk away, and I'll make sure you regret it. Forever." Sarah's fingers hovered over the pen. She knew this was the final move. The last decision that would define everything. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about survival. And she would survive.